Hello class, welcome back. We're going to continue our notes in Unit 3, Earth Systems and Resources, with a discussion on changing climates. To begin with, global change is really all highlighted in this Unit 9, which fits really nice in Earth systems as we talk about atmosphere structure. So that's how this kind of ties in. We'll begin talking about the greenhouse effect, what greenhouse gases are and how they work, impacts, consequences of a changing climate, and then things like ocean warming, ocean acidification, invasive species endangered, and human impacts, biodiversity were all covered in our ecosystems unit, so those are already done. To begin with, climate change and the greenhouse effect. Well, how are they linked together? The greenhouse effect is a normal, natural process on this planet, and it's good for moderating temperature and allowing our atmosphere and our planet to have some amount of heat trapped on the Earth, which is good that we have atmosphere that can do this. The basic way that this works is that we have solar radiation that's coming in as UV and visible lights. So we see that in our yellow lines here. The UV and visible light will hit the planet and be absorbed and heated up. That heat is then, as we have this UV here, we'll mark that. Okay. And then this is our IR. So this heat, the heat comes back up as infrared radiation. All right. Now, what happens? Well, in a nice moderated, regulated atmosphere, we're going to have some of this UV light bounce off, and we're going to have some infrared get out through the atmosphere and radiate out back out into space. Some of this is also going to be trapped in. So we see that here, so radiated out, and some of it gets trapped in and just kind of hangs out near the Earth's surface, which allows it to warm. But when we talk about step 3, these greenhouse gases absorbing infrared radiation, radiated back towards the Earth's surface, as we have more greenhouse gases, this process is enhanced, and that is the concern when we talk about climate change, right? So the concern here is this measured change over a long period of time. So it's change in temperature over this long period of time correlates very strongly with the change in greenhouse gases, particularly CO2, as we have measured through ice core data. One last term that we'll need to get down should be coming up here. Right here is the albedo effect. Again, this is a normal natural process, something we need to know. So the albedo effect refers to some of the solar radiation reflected back off out into space. And the idea that these are light-colored surfaces. So things like our clouds and ice, too. All right. So those two things, clouds and ice in particular, are going to reflect a good amount of light away from the planet. One of the concerns is, as a warming planet occurs, there's less ice covering the surface of our planet, which means less albedo, which means more of the solar rays will be absorbed. And we'll discuss that further in class. How do greenhouse gases warm our planet? They're not all created equal. When we look at these greenhouse gases, they have this term that we'll need to get in our notes here, this global warming potential, all right? Global warming potential is GWP, abbreviated often, refers to how much heat each gas traps in relative to carbon dioxide, and you'll see that on the next table. How much of each human-caused greenhouse gas contributes to total emissions around the globe. This is why carbon dioxide is kind of public enemy number one when we talk about its, global warming potential. Fluorinated gases are the worst, but fluorinated gases have kind of been dealt with, and we have about 2% of our total emissions. So yeah, they trap a lot more heat, but also they're the smallest amount. Versus carbon dioxide is, the largest greenhouse gas in terms of percent contribution, so that becomes our largest area of concern. In this table here, and you probably have to pause and create this and fill this out, but these are the key 5 greenhouse gases that you'll be asked to know, and this is the basic information of what you should be able to identify about each one of these things. Concern level is kind of generalized here, like none to medium to high, and just a brief explanation, and we'll talk about each of these in a little more detail. And global warming potential is just from this chart previously identified on the page there. So we have water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and fluorinated gases. These are the things that we need to know as our 5 major greenhouse gases. Sources are important too. Remember, water vapor is part of the water cycle, natural, no concern here. CO2, combustion of fossil fuels, largely the biggest issue, but deforestation and the natural process of cellular respiration as well um, are also sources here. Methane, again, our concern is super high for this one because it's the most abundant. Methane, agricultural sources, deforestation, natural gas combustion in particular, decomposition of organic matter. Medium, we can control a lot of this through agriculture and some fossil fuel regulation as well. Nitrous oxide, we're looking at agriculture as the primary factor in excess amounts. Fertilizers in particular is the big one here. This is kind of a medium one too, like sustainable soil practices. Less use of fertilizers would be a big solution for that. And then CFCs have been regulated by the Montreal Protocol. Refrigerants and aerosols. These are the regular CFCs have been regulated. Now we're working on other molecules like HCFCs and other variants of that that are still contributing to climate, but are just less harmful to the ozone. And again, like the warming potential is large there. What are the effects of a changing climate? So we stand to reason that while temperatures are increasing and they're being measured to be increasing, if the planet continues to warm, what are the likely consequences of that? And so we'll kind of go through each one of these. So if it gets warmer, ice sheets melt, sea level rises, and we are bound to lose some polar habitat as a result. This melting ice also creates more meltwater, which is going to disrupt our thermohaline circulation, right? So we talked about fresh water, right? Fresh water, warmer water that's in the ocean is going to be less dense. Remember, the cold, salty water sinks, and the fresh, warmer water is going to float near the top. And so that can disrupt those currents, which again affects the amount of heat distributed from the equator to the poles, which could affect an area like Europe, which is regulated by this warmer Gulf Stream coming up here. If that doesn't push as much warm water up near them, that can be an issue. Meltwater increasing sea levels and flooding coastal habitats can be a big one. I think we have just red areas here just around our Gulf area, and the areas that would be predicted to be at high risk of flooding in the coming years if sea level continues to rise. If it continues to get warmer, what are the effects of the ocean here? Well, two things that are big ones: ocean warming, right? That should be logical, right? The ocean temperature is going to increase if the planet increases in temperature. What are some issues? Well, we have something called thermal expansion, which is just increasing sea level as the molecules expand and get warmer. That helps to push sea level rise higher. That's just part of what we're talking about with temperature expansion. One of the biggest things we talk about in this class is coral bleaching, and the idea that as the warm temperature increases, the algae that are part of the coral aren't able to survive in their symbiotic relationship there that they have, and they bleach out. Basically, the algae die, which means the coral leaves a dead skeleton behind. The next thing is increasing energy in the atmosphere. As temperatures are warmer, there's more energy, which can lead to more violent storms or more frequent storms. We can also have metabolic rates of aquatic organisms increasing as a result of warmer temperatures and not being able to keep up with the demands of their metabolic rates going up. The next one is ocean acidification is another big one, aside from ocean warming. Acidification is the idea that as CO2 comes into the environment, some of it's going to absorb in the ocean because the ocean is a valuable carbon sink. But as we get more and more of this coming up, we have this ocean at about 8.1 normally. If we fall below 8 in the pH, this is more acidic. Now, is the ocean an acid? No, it's not. But as we have CO2 in the atmosphere coming in, we make carbonic acid, which is, again, a natural process. If this happens more frequently, what ends up happening is these carbonic acid molecules release these free hydrogen ions, and they attack carbonate ions. So these free hydrogens are going to start to form um, the bicarbonates. The carbonate ions are needed for shelled organisms and corals. And as we get more of this chemistry going on in the ocean, we get less of this. So it's a threat to the shelled organisms or organisms that need to make shells. So that's what sort of showing on the right side is a more acidic. So now we get more acidic. Remember, it's not an acid. It's just more acidic than normal. And this reaction is happening more quickly. So this is projected to be an issue if CO2 levels continue to rise as they're being measured. The last slide of effects, if the ocean continues to warm, more permafrost will melt. So we have our permafrost. We're looking at the globe from the top here. Continuous permafrost, things that ground that's always frozen, and then some sporadic and discontinuous is ground that's mostly frozen throughout the year. The issue with this is, besides habitat, is that there's a lot of methane storage in the permafrost. So as that melts, the methane is released, and methane is greenhouse gas, which will trap more heat. So right now it's kind of locked up in there. It can be released and cause further warming. Another thing of melting permafrost is sinking ground. Homes can collapse. You can see a home back here kind of tilted. These trees are called drunken trees because they grow on, the ground below them is sinking, and they're always trying to grow towards the sun, so they sink and then they kind of grow back towards the sun, and they get these weird shapes here. And then also one of the biggest ones we've talked about a little bit is just shifting biomes. Climate's altered, so biomes shift. So you can see like these zones, they're not labeled, but these zones just showing you that like the zone of hardiness or plant growth further south just kind of shifts up, right? So like Wisconsin is mostly purple here, then a big chunk of it becomes green in the warmer climate zone, which changes the plants that can grow in these areas. What are possible solutions? Well, renewable energy would reduce, more renewable energy reduce dependence on fossil fuels, which would reduce the amount of greenhouse gases created. So wind, solar, geothermal, get into those in more detail later in this course. Efficiency of energy, just making energy more efficient. So we use less of it, even if we're using fossil fuels, just using less. This term afforestation, which just refers to replanting forests. More trees equals less CO2 because they use that in photosynthesis. Reducing waste, efficient food production methods, and decreasing meat consumption can be kind of twofold, right? We waste less food, so there's less decomposition, there's less production, and then also, the meat consumption decreasing as well is really helpful in reducing greenhouse gases through the whole process of producing and transporting that meat. And then legislation at a governmental level, carbon tax and trading, increasing public transportation, and higher mileage standards all have the power to help reduce the amount of greenhouse gases produced as well. The last thing we'll discuss here is a kind of historic event that occurred in 1997. It was the Kyoto Protocol. And basically, this was the first climate change commitment that was brought forth in 1997. 160 nations recognized the need for this and signed off on this and pledged to reduce CO2 emissions. This called for a commitment to reduce greenhouse gases emissions 5.2% below the 1990 levels before 2012. Ultimately, this did not occur for everybody by any means, but as a historic environmental movement and the idea that there is a call for change, this is a noteworthy event. So this is something we kind of discuss as this historical legislation and the idea that nations are coming together to try to solve this issue. Since the Kyoto Protocol, there have been many other events that have taken place. Certainly we haven't solved the problem, but the drive to try to commit to meaningful change on a global level kind of began with this Kyoto Protocol.